ask you is your name. So maybe just tell us who you are and give us a little bit of a connection of why you're here. One sentence. John, can we start with you?
I'm John, current student here at the school, as well as currently interning with Tom at the student center.
My name is Kelsey. I am the ice cream aficionado. I'm currently working as a chaplain resident at Evergreen Hospital over in Kirkland. I'm Elizabeth. I am currently in the MA program for International Community Development at Forest, and I work full-time at Jubilee Beach, a nonprofit.
My name is Amari. I'm currently an admissions counselor and a recent grad school grad, and I'm doing this.
My name is Paul, and I'm a current student in the Theology and Culture and Counseling Psychology program.
Well, the first thing I want to ask you guys, pose to you guys, is just the question about your responses to the things that John was presenting. And when you look through that list of what researchers have said are characteristics of millennials, were there points of resonance for you? And I guess I want to ask you maybe what was the most powerful point of resonance, but maybe how you feel about that, because it can be a positive or a negative response to those details.
I felt that I'm right in the middle of that. I'm 25, so I'm kind of smack in the middle of that group, and I feel like it pretty much. I am the stereotypical millennial that describes me almost to a T. That's very much my experience. There was only a couple things that I was but very much. So it resonated very much with me, and with my community of other people in my life. It wasn't specifically my experience. I think it was shared with most of my peer community who are millennials. And I think I specifically resonated with kind of the struggle of like the millennial life. And definitely also my little misrepresented part was definitely resonated with me being told that I'm lazy and that millennials are lazy, and whereas I find that my generation is actually very hardworking and very entrepreneurial and very so that I like to correct that misrepresentation with Evangelist.
Yeah, I always have an issue with the lazy word as well. It's only because I think in other research it's hard. You'd be hard pressed to find another generation where they'll just flat out call somebody like narcissistic and lazy. And that be like research, which I think I don't want to discredit the view, but at the same time, it still kind of has a level of like not recognizing the context in which somebody would necessarily be narcissistic. I mean, I feel like there's so much emphasis on selling yourself in a job situation that it's impossible for us not to be expected to have some sense of narcissism, just because like you won't get a job if you're not. So I think. I definitely resonate with those things on the sheet, and I think with the laziness I think the laziness also can come out of a sense of not knowing what you want to do. So rather than going 100% at something that you have no idea of what you're doing, maybe 50% at something that you are kind of interested in. It's just one of those things. I think there just is more context than research necessarily gives, but I also think that context is really different depending on the person in that situation.
And I was thinking a lot about the experience piece, like matched with wanting to do what we love, and how like I really desire the experience, but there's a sense in which I'll only get hired for something that someone needs me to do, and it may not be what I'm passionate about. So like there's this desire not to settle for just another job, to like get something that will project me forward to what I love to do.
And the reality of like the financial demands on our lives, like how much we want to be doing things that are meaningful, impactful, social activism, all of this stuff, and the reality of like how in debt we are and how much we need to just work a job that whoever will hire us. Work 2 jobs, work 3 jobs.
I want to pick up on that point a little bit, because in some ways when we talk about millennials, we tend to define them in terms of what we as other generations have that you don't have, right? And so then we define millennials often in terms of lack, in terms of things that are missing. So I guess what I really want to do is ask you, when you think about the future, what are the places of hope? What makes you glad to be where you are in terms of the historical timeline right now? So I really want to put an emphasis on the positive and not get stuck just in terms of the challenges.
I think the fact that we're all kind of in the same place, I think is really hopeful. Just because it's not as if like there's a group of people who are like millennials and they're just killing it right now, and then the rest of us are like, oh, pretty much behind. Essentially, it's like I think there is an even plane where we all kind of feel slightly like, what are we doing? And then, but that's a shared experience. I mean, like even I was watching a TV show, I don't know if you guys said Girls, and it's like all with Lena Dunham, and it's all based on the fact that she's like a 25-year-old who has no idea what she's doing, and all of her decisions based on that idea that she has no idea what she's doing. And I think like I was able to connect so much with that because even though she was outlandish and crazy and stuff, it still felt like, okay, I get where I know where you're at. So I think there's hopeful points that there's kind of like there's a synergy of knowing like we are into social justice and we are into change and we do think that things need to be fixed or bettered or improved. And I think but also realizing that there's not people who are doing it really, really well and we just didn't get the memo yet. It's like we all are kind of on the same place trying to figure it out. So hopefully if one person figures it out, it kind of, the whole group kind of can get caught on rather than it being like a group gets it and a significant group doesn't.
Do any of you feel that in fact some millennials have gotten it or have figured out parts of it in ways that really are exciting and novel that can't be characteristic of other generations?
I think the willingness to go and do something radical with your life is kind of, and part of that may be because there's like a necessity to it, like this, there's nothing else for me to do but do something crazy. But I think part of that's like the awakening to social justice issues, which I think is partially due to how connected we are with the digital age and how like starving children in Africa are so much closer to us than perhaps in previous generations if you weren't a social justice person. And I think that kind of idea that our generation is very aware of injustice and environmental issues and all of these things, and that's quite important to us, is very hopeful to me. And that is, to my mind, a good thing that we are more liberal and more tolerant and that there's an openness to embrace new ideas and new solutions and kind of that desire to embrace creative collaboration.
Kelsey, what makes you hopeful?
I was thinking about how much choice there is. And sometimes, like I read an article one time that says when people stand in line at Target and they're trying to pick out toothpaste, because there are so many choices, their brain literally shuts down. And you cannot make a choice because there are so many options. So I feel this tension of our generation has so many options. We can go to any grad school because we can take out loans or we can have 10 credit cards. I mean, there's so many choices. And yet because of the limitations, we're needing to think about those choices in a more creative way, or at least try to. And so I think there is more willingness to risk failure and to stretch what that word really means. So like living with your parents, not looking at that as failure, but that's innovative. Or we were talking, we live in a community house and we have a garden, and that's kind of innovative, but I grew up on a farm, so it's necessity as well. So kind of taking wisdom from other generations of what was necessary and what is innovative and how do we combine that. I think that's something that's just kind of what needs to be happening for our generation because we have so many choices. So what worked then, what could work, and how do we move forward in a direction like that.
John, how are you living out what you see as the strengths of millennials?
How am I living that up? Just exploring social entrepreneurship, exploring what that looks like, the pros and cons of it, embracing it a little bit more and realizing the benefit of pursuing that. I mean, it's also challenging about that. So I've never been one to kind of just go off and do my own thing. I tend to follow what people are doing. But I'm greatly encouraged by, as Josie mentioned, kind of, I think it's easy to think as millennials that no other generation understands what we're going through. So this today is encouraging me that we have people from all generations sitting in the same room discussing this. And we're realizing that like you all understand what is going on or are wanting to know more about what it is like for millennials. I think it's easy to think that you're all clueless to what we're going through or what challenges we face, but I don't necessarily think that's true.
Yeah, I was going to say to your original question about what gives me hope, talking about like community is an interesting piece because the way that we've had to adapt, one of the ways that we've adapted to our financial situations is like to go actually into community. Like I also live in community housing and like we have a garden and yes, it's out of necessity, but it's also out of a lifestyle. Like I want to slow down a little bit. I've realized things are like there's this racing train and it's going too quick and just sort of wanting to slow down the pace of our life and what is imagining church too, like so actually like we've left the formal church where we actually live in our church, like within our neighborhood and in our community. And what does it look like to reach out to people instead of like my parents' generation, they live next to someone for 20 years and you don't really know them. And so we're getting to know, like be grounded in something and getting to know where we're at.
I think there's a switch from kind of like my parents' generation of, okay, now we're finally mobile, let's go be mobile. And then our generation is like, oh, we have the option. We don't have to be on wheels all of the time. We can actually use our feet and walk slowly on our space, in our neighborhood, in our context. And so I think there's this switch of we have so much digital access, and again, this choice of, but we don't have to. We don't have to always do that. And so I think like different spiritual practices, different spiritual disciplines are just resurfacing like crazy because this idea of Sabbath is again so novel for us, but it's literally been around for centuries. And so I think again this rediscovery of people older than us actually have so much wisdom, and how do we partner with intergenerational mentors? And so whether it's living in community or living with your parents or living in a community, finding those people who've been doing things to slow down. We call it slow down, they call it life.
Now that's interesting, like you're saying, like you, like as a collective, like we don't know what to do. Like I don't know what to do with our life, but actually we're coming together to say like, hey, we don't know what to do together.
Yeah. And I think also too, like the fact, like I would consider myself completely opposite in terms of I don't want to slow down. Like I feel like mobility gave me the freedom to move around and do a lot. But like as you're speaking to like the choice to do that, like I think we're a lot more universally tolerant of the fact that you can want to go slow and I can want to go everywhere, and that can be okay. And that doesn't have to mean like one of us is transient and one of us is grounded. It just means like there's a different type of life that you're choosing to live, and that has nothing to do with. Well, it has to do with me, but not in a sense where that is some way like impeding on what I need to be doing or what I'm doing. So it's like there's an interconnectedness without it feeling like an oppressive force of like this is how it should be, but you're not operating within that mindset. And I think other times, like in older generations, there was more of a focus on okay, like you are mobile until you're able to ground yourself, and grounding yourself is really ultimate what you're trying to go for. And then, but like for people like me, that's not what I'm ultimately trying to go for. Like I don't want that, at least not right now. So it's one of those things. It's just I think there's just it's cool just seeing the tolerance and perspectives and not feeling like because like something works for one person and a facet of this community doesn't, like, because community might look completely different for me, but we still value a community. So I just think there's a lot more tolerance, a lot more understanding, and a lot more acceptance of the fact that the way it looks for you might not be the way it looks for me, but at the same time that's not an issue. It's just cool. Like it's a cool way of coexisting without it being like we all have to make sure it works for all of us. Because I don't think that's ever going to happen.
We can have a conversation about it.
Exactly.
I think it's the switch from in previous generations. It was we lead, behave, belong, and we're more in a generation of we belong is first, then behave, then maybe believe. And believe is even a maybe. And like you said, you just said you can have differences of opinion and that's okay, but you belong first and foremost. And so there's this kind of ships passing of they're the same categories, but I think we're just realigning them maybe a little bit differently than previous generations.
Let's talk a little bit more about that believe factor, because looking from the outside into your generation, it's both terrifying and inspiring to see what you're doing with faith. On the one hand, millennials are creating these just amazing expressions of church that I want to be part of, but I feel like I'm too old to be part of. So I feel like the reinvention of the church is now in your hands, and you're doing just phenomenal things. On the other hand, you hear about millennials, being maybe the least interested generation in spiritual issues. Well, I should say in Christianity as conventionally defined. And so you have to wonder, well, what will become of the church, in terms of the whole generation? I wonder if you can comment on that, or even tell stories of people who maybe illustrate that tension.
I'm pulling on board with Paul about the community element, and that is church for me, not really it's Sunday service. It's not. It's about living together with shared practices, and practicing our spirituality together in that setting. Not that I don't even necessarily disagree with institutional church. I just feel like there's this movement more towards something that's centered around a shared life together rather than going to a building once a week. Not that every church is like that, but
Can you describe a typical day in your church life?
no.
No.
You wake up and sometimes there's one person around, sometimes there's 9 other people around. Sometimes you eat breakfast with people, and have really intense conversation at breakfast time with one another, whether that's about something culturally or about our spiritual lives together. We meet once a week, have an intentional meal together, and have a meeting, and have spiritual direction time with one another, and intentionally check in with one another, and see where the others are, what seems to be on their minds for that week, and if there are, Tom and I have been doing some video blogs, and I mentioned how oftentimes, or we find even, we live in a house with multiple generations, and funny that we find the same struggles for all of us. We have someone who's in their 50s and rents out a house, and had all of a sudden his renter is left and he didn't know what to do, and he needed to kind of make some improvements to the house in order to get things going again. And so we, as a community, we're going to support you in this and whatever you need at this moment. If financially you can't pay rent here, don't worry about it. We'll cover it. And then multiple of us went to help him improve some of his stuff in his house that he's working on. Just the support that we can offer one another when someone's having a hard time. I think I'm slowly moving towards this idea, and I think this has always been an idea, but maybe we're coming back around to it, that church is more about a family that's supporting one another in whatever way. It's not about tithing and putting a bunch of money into a pot together. It's about offering support when somebody needs it, whatever that is.
I would agree. I think my experience with institutional church has been very sad to me, because I grew up in the church, and it just for years have been struggling and wrestling with it, because as much as I wanted to and as much as I try to engage, it has very little to do with my life and very little to say to me, and very little for me to say to it. There's not it's like this foreign entity that as much as I try to integrate into my life, I really struggle, and I find that I have much more real experience and dialogue and interaction in other
life that are actually relevant. And I know that, I mean, church tries very hard to be relevant. It works really hard to do that in institutional church. But I mean, so many of my friends grew up in the church and left the church because it just doesn't connect with them at all on any level. It's so apart from them that there would be no reason to go. And I think I sporadically attend institutional church on Sunday mornings, and it's more out of because I feel like it's something I should do or I want it to mean something to me, but rather than actually meaning something to me. So yeah, I think we're so focused on community, most millennials that I know are so focused on community. Community is so important to us, and it's just really lacking unless your life is the church, where like that's somehow your whole friends and family and everything already integrated into that. Like I move a lot, so like moving to another city and going to a church is like, all right, well, there's a random sermon that maybe I got a few good like things to write down, but there's nothing there. Whereas I have lots of friends from all different versions of Christianity and non-Christian spiritual people, and I find that I have much more of an edifying experience, of a spiritually challenging experience, of a spiritually growing experience with those people, even if they're not Christians, even if they don't identify as Christians, than I do at a church.
And I could be speaking out of a slight entitlement, but I think sometimes the church just has a hard time of working organically. Like I think with the community of conventional institutional church, like I was in the life group, but that life group meets for an hour and a half every week, and then then there's church on Sundays. And for me, someone who kind of likes the fluidity of life and kind of doing kind of your own thing, and the variation of not having to feel so like, okay, let me sit with these people because we're randomly put in this group and we're really going to make this connection and we're really going to get to know each other. We're going to love each other and cry every week. And if you don't get there, like it's like you want to get there, and I think it's one of those things. It's just like a friend that could be sometimes a little too clingy. It's like where you really love this friend. This friend is great, but then this friend can do too much. And so it's like, and so you really want to connect with church, or you really want to make that established connection, but at the same time, like it's hard to create a friendship with somebody that you're not organically connected to, or that you feel like you have to schedule out a time every week on a Tuesday to be connected to. Like that just becomes hard to create that bond with someone. And so the same relationship is with church. When it kind of falls into the same kind of category week to week to week to week, and your whole life doesn't operate that way, like the way you build relationships doesn't operate that way, but then now you then remove yourself from your conventional life and then into this Christian life that now works on a week to week, hour and a half, 2 hour basis, it just becomes a little, for me, I feel like I'm slightly more inauthentic because I have to, like, okay, get it together. This is the relationship you're building, like, rather than it being like, we're here together. We're just going to let it be. Whatever happens with this interaction is what